In 1974, a young ecologist named Daniel Voss left his cabin in Yellowstone with a backpack, a camera, and a very simple plan: to hike the route, take some pictures, and return before dark. He was prepared. He had a permit, a map, water, food, and experience. He was seen in the morning, calm, composed, and even inspired. And then he vanished. Not for a week, not for a month, not for 52 years. And when the answer finally appeared, it turned out to be a bit stranger than the usual story about a missing hiker, because along with him they found a camera, and in the camera a roll of film, and the last frames contained something that is still impossible to fully explain. And it is important to understand where all this happened. Yellowstone is not just a park with beautiful scenery. According to the US National Park Service, there are more than 10,000 hydrothermal features here and over 500 geysers, one of the most geologically active places on Earth. The Earth there literally breathes, and sometimes it takes. If you love stories where the investigation relies on details, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Today they will be important.
The morning of Wednesday, August 14th, 1974, arrived over the Lamar Valley the way it always did in high summer, cold at the edges and gold at the center. The sun clearing the ridgeline to the east, like something slow and deliberate, spreading amber light across sage flats still damp from an overnight thunderstorm. At 6:02 in the morning, the temperature at the Mammoth Hot Springs weather station read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time Daniel Aldric Voss stepped out of Cabin 7 at the Roosevelt Lodge, pulled the door shut behind him, and stopped to breathe the morning in, it had climbed to 44. He would remember that cold, that particular quality of summer cold that only the northern Rockies could produce even in August, for the rest of his life. Or so he planned to, standing there at the edge of the wooden porch with a tin mug of instant coffee steaming against his chest, watching the steam rise from his own mouth and merge with the vapor rising from the mug. Daniel was 26 years old. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 162 pounds. A lean, angular young man with a narrow jaw, close-cropped dark brown hair that had started to grow out in the weeks he'd been traveling, and green eyes that the people who knew him best said were always looking slightly past whatever they appeared to be fixed on, as if he were cataloging the thing behind the obvious thing, storing it away. He was a third-year graduate student in the Department of Ecology and Environmental Biology at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, though he had taken the summer as personal leave, neither formally enrolled nor formally disconnected. The trip to Yellowstone was his own initiative, funded by savings from 2 years of teaching assistant stipends and a modest inheritance from his maternal grandfather, a retired machinist from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who had spent every spare dollar on National Geographic subscriptions and had pressed the entire run from 1948 onward into Daniel's hands before his death in 1971. "There's more truth in photographs," the old man had told him, "than in anything a professor will say to you." Daniel had written that sentence on the first page of every field notebook he'd kept since. The Nikon F2 photomic was sitting on the wooden shelf beside the door when he went back inside to retrieve his pack. He had purchased it 8 months earlier from a camera dealer on East 42nd Street in Manhattan, paying $312 in cash, 3 months of saved stipend money, and had since put nearly 18 rolls of Kodachrome 64 through its mechanism, shooting everything from shorebirds on Cayuga Lake to highway construction sites to the faces of strangers in the Columbus Avenue subway station. The camera was his second language. He carried it the way other people carried wallets. Loaded into it that morning was roll number 19, a fresh 36 exposure Kodachrome 64 he had loaded the previous evening by the light of the cabin's single overhead bulb, the film advancing smoothly until the frame counter stopped at the number 1. His plan for the day, written in the small green notebook he kept in the left breast pocket of his canvas field shirt, was methodical and specific. He would depart the Roosevelt Lodge trailhead no later than 7 o'clock in the morning, heading southeast on the northeast entrance road connector to the Tower Junction, then picking up the trail south along the Yellowstone River toward Tower Fall, where he intended to photograph the basalt columns in the morning light. From Tower Fall, he would continue south along the rim trail toward the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, stopping at Inspiration Point and Artist Point to shoot the canyon in afternoon light before making his return via the North Rim Trail to complete a loop of approximately 16 miles. He had applied for and received a backcountry day use permit at the ranger station the previous afternoon, permit number 74-8-1122-D, issued by Ranger First Class Gerald M. Ortega, whose careful block printing filled in the departure time, the route, and the expected return of no later than 6 o'clock in the evening on August 14th. Daniel had noted the permit number at the top of his itinerary page, underlined it, and beneath it written the single reminder, "Back before dark. Call Mom tonight." He had called his mother, Carol Ann Voss, on the payphone in the Roosevelt Lodge lobby the previous evening, at precisely 7:14 in the evening. The call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds according to the lodge's billing record. She was a practical woman, a high school librarian from Binghamton, who wore bifocals on a beaded chain and kept a world atlas permanently open on the kitchen table, its spine broken at the page, showing the western United States. He had told her he was well, that the park was extraordinary, that the light in the late afternoon had turned the canyon walls the color of fire, and that he expected to complete the loop the following day and drive south toward Jackson Hole on Thursday. She told him to drink enough water. He promised he would. She told him she was proud of him. He said, "I know, Mom. Get some sleep." He hung up and walked back across the lobby with his hands in his pockets, nodding at the desk clerk, a college student named Ray Tillman, who was spending the summer working his way through the parks before starting at UCLA in the fall, and disappeared up the stairs to his room. At 6:47 in the morning on August 14th, Daniel Aldric Voss shouldered his Kelty external frame backpack, approximately 23 pounds loaded, including 2 liters of water, a lunch of peanut butter crackers and dried apricots, a first aid kit, a topographic map of the park's northern sector, a compass, a rain jacket, his field notebook, and the Nikon F2 photo mic with its 50mm f1.4 lens and 4 additional rolls of Kodachrome 64 in a soft vinyl pouch, and walked out of the Roosevelt Lodge parking area. Ray Tillman, who was resetting breakfast items behind the front counter, glanced up and watched him go through the front window. He told investigators this later with the precision of someone who had, in the intervening years, replayed the memory so many times it had become worn smooth, like a river stone. He walked out into the parking lot, Ray said, and he stopped at the edge of the asphalt, where the gravel starts. He stopped and looked up. I don't know what he was looking at, maybe just the sky. Then he turned right and started walking. There was a pause before he added, "He walked like someone with somewhere to go."
This phrase, "he walked like a man who has somewhere to go," sounds almost insignificant. But in disappearance cases, such details often become very important. The last witness doesn't say, "He looked confused, scared, sick, or unsure." On the contrary, Daniel seems composed, calm, even inspired, and this sharply narrows the field of initial theories. He doesn't look like a man who was already in trouble at that moment. He doesn't look like a fugitive. He doesn't look like someone who decided to disappear on an impulse. We are looking at a man with a route, a plan, permission to leave, and a promise to call his mother in the evening. And that is why the question becomes even more disturbing. What could have happened next for such a person to disappear literally within the first few miles of his journey?
The weather at Tower Junction at 7 o'clock in the morning was clear, with scattered high cirrus cloud and a sustained westerly breeze of 8 miles per hour. A family of 4 from Sacramento, the Hendersons, was loading their station wagon in the parking area across from the Ranger contact station when Daniel came down the trail connector. The father, Thomas Henderson, a 40-year-old civil engineer with a neatly trimmed mustache, told investigators he remembered the young man because he had paused to look at the family's road map, spread across the car hood, asked if they were heading toward Cook City, and when they said yes, told them the light up there in the early morning was extraordinary and they should stop at the pullout above Soda Butte Creek. He seemed very knowledgeable, Thomas said, and enthusiastic, really genuinely enthusiastic about the place. You don't always meet people like that. His daughter, 7-year-old Melissa Henderson, told investigators, through her mother, that the man had shown her his camera and let her look through the viewfinder at the treetops. That was at approximately 7:09 in the morning. The Hendersons drove north. Daniel turned south. The trail absorbed him within 40 yards. the lodgepole pines closing behind him the way water closes over a dropped stone. No one saw him at Tower Fall, though the conditions would have made the photography exceptional. The 132-foot plume of water catching the morning sun at an angle that turned its mist into suspended fire. The hexagonal basalt columns rising around it like the ruins of something ancient. No photograph from that location was ever definitively attributed to him. It is possible he was there and shot nothing that morning, saving his frames for something else. It is equally possible he never reached Tower Fall at all. The trail was empty. The light was perfect. And somewhere between the parking area at Tower Junction and the basalt columns above the fall, on a Tuesday morning in the second year of the Ford administration, in the oldest national park in the world, Daniel Aldric Voss turned a corner in the lodgepole forest and stepped out of the known world entirely. The missing person report was filed at 8:43 in the evening on August 14, 1974, at the Canyon Village Ranger Station. It was filed not by Carol Ann Voss, she would not know her son was missing for another 16 hours, but by Ray Tillman, the desk clerk at Roosevelt Lodge, who had grown concerned when Daniel failed to return by 6 o'clock in the evening, as specified on his permit, and who had waited an additional 2 hours, watching the parking area through the lobby window, before walking across to the contact station to speak with the duty ranger. The duty ranger at Roosevelt Lodge that evening was a 29-year-old seasonal employee named Frank Casillas, a compact, dark-haired man from Albuquerque who was completing his third summer in the park and who had, in that time, participated in 14 search and rescue operations ranging from a lost child recovered within 4 hours to a climber fatality on the Absaroka Range. He took the report seriously and immediately. By 9 o'clock in the evening, he had radioed Canyon Village and the park's law enforcement division, relayed the permit information, and organized an initial search team of 3 rangers to cover the Tower Junction area with headlamps. The initial search on the night of August 14th found nothing. The trail from Tower Junction south to Tower Fall was walked twice in the darkness, once going south, once returning, and produced no sign. The basalt columns at Tower Fall were examined by lantern. Nothing. The North Rim Trail connector east of Canyon Village was checked as far as the 3.4-mile marker. Nothing. At 2:17 in the morning on August 15th, the search was stood down pending daylight, with the trail approaches cordoned and a ranger stationed at the Tower Junction trailhead to intercept Daniel if he had simply been delayed and was still walking in. He was not. He was not walking in on August 15th or on August 16th or on any of the 11 days that followed. What unfolded over those 11 days was the most extensive ground search Yellowstone National Park had mounted since a boating accident on Yellowstone Lake in 1971. The incident commander was Chief Ranger Howard Parrish, a 52-year-old career National Park Service employee from Jackson, Wyoming, who wore his gray-green uniform with the rigid formality of someone who understood that formality was a tool of order, and order was what you needed when people were afraid. He organized the search into 4 operational zones extending south from Tower Junction through the Canyon Village sector, east toward the Lamar Valley drainage, west across the plateau toward Norris, and southeast along the Yellowstone River corridor toward Hayden Valley. He had, at peak deployment, 47 personnel committed to the search, 22 park rangers, 8 seasonal interpretive staff reassigned to ground operations, 6 volunteers from the Cody Mountain Rescue Team, a 4-person team from the Wyoming National Guard equipped with infrared spotting equipment, and 7 members of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Unit from Bozeman. The terrain did not cooperate. The plateau north of the Canyon Village area sits at approximately 8,000 feet of elevation, and the forest there is dense lodgepole, corridor after corridor of arrow-straight trees on a flat substrate of volcanic tuff, each corridor identical to every other. The compass the only meaningful distinction between north and south. The soil between the trees is a mixture of decomposed volcanic ash and pine duff that holds footprints for no more than a day in dry weather and erases them entirely after rain. It had rained on the night of August 15th, not heavily, perhaps 1/3 of an inch, but enough to scrub the trails clean of anything that had been there the day before. The bloodhounds brought in from the Teton County Sheriff on August 17th 2 experienced trailing dogs, Rounder and Blue, and their handler, a 60-year-old former law enforcement officer named Chester Pike, who kept a cigarette behind his left ear at all times, were given Daniel's hiking boots, which had been left behind in Cabin 7 in exchange for the heavier boots he wore on the trail. Rounder showed interest at the Tower Junction trailhead, pulled southeast along the trail for approximately 200 yards, and then circled twice and sat down, which Chester Pike described as the dog losing the scent with no discernible explanation. Blue showed interest in a different direction entirely, north toward the road, which produced nothing after 300 yards of eager tracking. On the afternoon of August 19th, 5 days into the search, a member of the Gallatin County team found an object approximately 1.2 miles south of Tower Junction, in a small clearing between 2 lodgepole groupings, where a flat outcrop of rhyolite formed a natural rest-stop shelf above the trail. The object was a dried apricot, a single dried apricot, sitting on the flat shelf of rock, as if placed there deliberately rather than dropped accidentally. Its dried skin wrinkled, and its color faded from orange to a dull amber in the sun. The finder, a 23-year-old volunteer searcher named Keith Denton, photographed it in place before picking it up with gloved hands and placing it in an evidence bag. He called it in. Chief Ranger Parrish drove out with Ranger Casillas within the hour. The 3 of them stood around the dried apricot on its rhyolite shelf in the afternoon light and said very little. The apricot matched, in type, in brand, in the packing style, the dried apricots that Daniel Voss had purchased 2 days before his disappearance at the park's general store in Canyon Village. The receipt was found in his cabin's wastebasket. 6 apricots of the same batch had been in his pack. No others were found on or near any section of trail. It was a breadcrumb. It was, as Ranger Casillas noted in his incident report filed on August 22nd, the only physical evidence identified in 11 days of coordinated search operations across approximately 240 square miles of terrain. He noted further, subject appears to have passed this point and continued. Beyond this point, no further sign was found. The aerial component of the search, a Bell Jet Ranger helicopter provided by the Wyoming Army National Guard, and a smaller fixed-wing Cessna 182 from the park's aviation resource pool, conducted 21 flight hours over the search area between August 15th and August 23rd, including 2 passes with forward-looking infrared equipment on the evenings of August 17th and 19th. The infrared detected several large heat sources in the forest that proved, on investigation, to be bison and elk. It detected nothing consistent with a human subject. The hydrothermal areas were checked as a matter of protocol. The park's thermal basins presented a grim possibility in any case involving someone walking alone and off-trail, but none of the basin areas along the projected route showed any evidence of a recent incident, and the sulfurous chemistry of the water and soil around active thermal features would, the investigators were told by the park's senior geologist, render the bloodhound's work functionally useless within a short radius. On August 25, 1974, 11 days after Daniel Voss was last seen alive, Chief Ranger Howard Parrish held a meeting with his search coordinators, the Gallatin County team, and 2 National Park Service law enforcement supervisors from Denver who had been monitoring the operation. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes. At the conclusion, a memorandum was signed reducing the search to continuous, limited mode, a formal NPS classification, meaning that active, coordinated operations were suspended, but the case remained open, and that rangers conducting routine patrol would continue to keep the search objectives in mind. The case was classified as a missing person of unknown status. No determination of cause was made. There was no evidence of an accident. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no evidence at all, beyond a single dried apricot on a shelf of rhyolite, that Daniel Aldric Voss had ever walked south from Tower Junction on the morning of August 14, 1974. The news reached Carol Ann Voss by telephone at her home in Binghamton, New York, on the morning of August 16th, 2 days into the search. She had already called the Roosevelt Lodge 4 times by then, receiving each time the same careful reassurance from the lodge manager that everything possible was being done. When Chief Ranger Parrish called her directly, she did not scream. She did not cry on the telephone. She asked him in a precise and level voice, 3 specific questions: whether her son was the kind of person who would have gone off-trail, whether the hydrothermal areas had been checked, and whether there was any possibility of foul play. Parrish answered each question as honestly as he was able. She thanked him and hung up. Then she drove to her neighbor Margaret Hollis's house 3 blocks away and sat at her kitchen table and did not move for 4 hours. The case file for missing person Daniel Aldric Voss, NPS, incident number 74-Y-2287, was stored in the filing system of Yellowstone National Park's Law Enforcement Division, first in a metal drawer in the Canyon Village Ranger Station, then, after the administrative reorganization of 1979, in a cardboard transfer box in the archival storage of the park's main administrative building in Mammoth Hot Springs. It was not forgotten exactly. Forgotten implies that someone once remembered it with urgency and then ceased to. The file was reviewed periodically, once in 1976, by a Park Service cold case coordinator from Denver named Arthur Breen, who added 3 pages of notes and recommended further soil analysis near the hydrothermal features east of Cascade Creek. Once in 1981, by a graduate student in criminal justice at the University of Wyoming, who was writing a thesis on National Park missing person statistics and asked to see the file as part of her research, and once in 1988 by a private investigator hired by Carol Ann Voss, who drove all the way from Binghamton to Mammoth Hot Springs in a rented Ford Fairmont and spent 2 days going through the original documents. His name was Robert Eves, and he was a former New York State Police detective with 31 years of service, a wiry man in his late 50s who wore reading glasses on a retractable cord and who had, in his professional opinion, seen every category of missing person case the continent could produce. He spent the second evening sitting in his car outside the administrative building with the folder on the passenger seat and the overhead light on, reading the incident report a final time. Then he drove back to his motel and called Carol Ann Voss and told her, as gently as he could, that there was nothing here that pointed anywhere specific. "The park is enormous," he said. "It's 2.2 million acres. And whatever happened in those first few miles of trail on that day, it happened cleanly." Carol Ann had kept her son's room largely intact, in the way that parents of the missing do, not as a shrine, not theatrically, but simply because changing the room felt like a declaration she wasn't prepared to make. His National Geographic collection, inherited from her father, filled one entire wall in floor-to-ceiling shelves. His Cornell Field notebooks from the 2 years before his disappearance occupied a plastic bin on the desk. His extra pair of hiking boots, the heavier pair he had not taken that day, the pair whose scent the hounds had been given, sat on the floor of the closet in the same position he had left them, toes pointing outward at a slight angle, as if their owner had just stepped out of them. Carol kept the closet door open. She said later that she did it because she could see them from her reading chair in the hallway, and it felt, at a certain distance, as though he had simply gone to the kitchen for something. She wrote letters. She wrote to the National Park Service every year for the first decade, each January, requesting an update on the case's status. The responses were consistent and courteous. No new information had been received. The case remained open. If she had information to contribute, she was encouraged to contact the park directly. She kept every response in a 3-ring binder. There were 14 of them. In 1983, she organized, through correspondence, and then through the early infrastructure of what would become a national network, a gathering of families of missing persons from national park cases. 11 families attended, convening in a conference room at a Holiday Inn in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in October of that year. Carol chaired the meeting in a tan blazer and her bifocals on their beaded chain, and she spoke for 40 minutes about documentation practices and the importance of keeping case files current at the county and federal level. She did not speak about her son specifically. She distributed photocopied fact sheets. 3 of the 11 families had cases that were eventually resolved. The world moved through its decades. The Vietnam War ended. Nixon resigned. Carter gave way to Reagan. Compact discs arrived. Fax machines replaced telegrams in the ranger stations. The Soviet Union dissolved. The internet connected the continent in ways that previous searchers could not have imagined. Carol Ann Voss developed cataracts in her left eye in 1991 and had the lens replaced. She retired from the Binghamton Library in 1994 after 27 years, threw herself a retirement party, and drove alone across the country to see the Grand Canyon, which Daniel had meant to visit after Yellowstone and had never reached. She stood at the south rim in the late afternoon and looked at the colors coming up from the inner gorge and felt something she could not name. Not resolution, not grief specifically, but the sensation of standing at the exact intersection of his unfinished sentence. Meanwhile, in Yellowstone, seasons passed over the landscape that had last held him. The lodgepole forest south of Tower Junction burned in the massive 1988 fires, the same fires that consumed nearly a third of the park's surface area and reshaped the entire northern plateau. Where there had been dense corridor after corridor of identical trees, there was now open hillside, blackened snag forest, slowly giving way to new growth. The young lodgepoles returning as they always did, dense, competitive, filling space with the quiet industriousness of organisms that had evolved specifically to follow fire. The terrain that searchers had described in 1974, impenetrable, identical, confounding, was transformed. New trails were cut, old trail markers were replaced. Ground that had been impossible to see from the air in 1974 was now, in the burned and regenerating zones, open for hundreds of yards in every direction. None of it produced Daniel Voss. By 2005, 31 years after his disappearance, the case had achieved a kind of ambient notoriety specific to the genre, a presence in the early true crime forums that had bloomed on the new internet, a mention in 2 books about national park missing persons, a short entry on a website called Locations Unknown that listed it alongside 43 other unresolved park disappearances. On the forum threads, the theories accumulated like sediment. He had fallen into a hydrothermal pool, and the body had been dissolved by the acidic water. He had been attacked by a bear. The evidence scattered and eventually covered by the 1988 fires. He had, for reasons unknown, walked away from his life, abandoned graduate school and identity and mother and everything, and built himself into someone else entirely, in some city where no one would look for him. This last theory, the one that implied volition, troubled Carol Ann Voss more than any of the others, not because she believed it, but because she recognized that others did, and that its existence in public discourse was a second disappearance of its own kind, an erasure of the person she knew her son to be. She did not post on the forums. She maintained her binder. On the morning of Thursday, June 18, 2026, a hydrological monitoring technician named Priya Chedha was working along the northern drainage corridor of the Tower Creek watershed, approximately 1.9 miles south-southeast of Tower Junction, as part of a multi-year thermal monitoring study conducted jointly by the United States Geological Survey and the National Park Service. She was 28 years old, Priya, the daughter of an engineer from Fremont, California, and she had been working in the park since March, embedded with the monitoring team and responsible for maintaining the network of sensors that tracked ground temperature fluctuations in the soil around the park's secondary hydrothermal areas, the diffuse zones of elevated thermal activity that lay outside the famous geyser basins, but shared their geological infrastructure. She was precise and methodical, and by her own description, constitutionally incapable of walking past an interesting rock formation without stopping to look at it. At 9:17 in the morning, she was descending a shallow drainage channel between 2 rhyolite outcroppings, moving off the established trail to reach a monitoring sensor that had been giving erratic temperature readings for 3 weeks, when her left boot caught on something partially buried in the debris at the base of the rock. She felt resistance where there should not have been resistance, stopped, looked down, and saw the corner of something dark and rectangular, protruding from the accumulated pine duff and decomposed leaf matter that had been building up in the drainage channel for decades. She crouched and began, with the careful lateral brush of her gloved hand, to clear the debris away from the object. It took her 4 minutes, which she measured with the stopwatch on her field watch, because she was the kind of person who measured things. What emerged was a camera bag. Not a camera bag in any condition that suggested recent presence, but a camera bag that had become, over 52 years of exposure and burial, and the slow chemistry of organic decomposition in a drainage channel that retained moisture 9 months out of 12, a kind of fossil of itself. The black vinyl exterior had cracked, and then softened, and then stiffened again into something that suggested coal more than fabric. The zipper was seized solid with rust that had consumed its brass fittings and migrated into the surrounding material. The strap, which Priya could see beneath a second layer of duff, was still attached at one end to the bag's D-ring, but had separated at the other end. Its stitching dissolved decades earlier. She did not open it. She was not equipped to open it, and she knew, from her 2 years of work in the park and her understanding of the protocols for unexpected finds, that opening it was not her role. She photographed it extensively from every angle with her field camera, a digital unit that embedded GPS coordinates in each image's metadata. She logged the location as 44.892 degrees north, 110.413 degrees west in her field book. She radioed the park's law enforcement division at 9:31 in the morning. She sat beside the bag on the rhyolite outcrop and ate an energy bar and waited. The senior ranger who responded was a 14-year NPS veteran named Catherine Weller, 41 years old, from Fort Collins, Colorado, with short salt and pepper hair and the particular economy of movement that develops in people who spend significant portions of their lives moving through difficult terrain. She reached Priya's position at 10:48 in the morning after hiking in from the closest trail access point with an evidence kit and a pair of latex-free gloves. She examined the bag without touching it for 6 minutes, walking slowly around it, examining it from every angle. Then she photographed it herself, radioed her findings to the Canyon Village station, and called for the park's forensic coordinator. The forensic coordinator was Dr. Marcus Reeve, a 55-year-old NPS law enforcement specialist based in Washington, D.C., who had spent the bulk of his career working cold cases in the national parks, a relatively obscure subfield of forensic investigation that required equal fluency in geology, ecology, forensic science, and archival research. He arrived at the park by charter flight from Denver the following morning, Friday, June 19th, at 8:40 in the morning. By noon, he was at the drainage site with a full evidence team. The camera bag was excavated with the precision of an archaeological dig, each layer of debris removed, photographed, bagged, and labeled. The bag itself, once free of its context, was placed in a climate-controlled transport container and taken to the park's evidence storage facility at Mammoth Hot Springs. It was Dr. Reeve who recognized it. Not immediately. He had worked dozens of cases involving equipment left in the backcountry, and camera bags of that era were not so distinctive that they leaped from the pile of institutional memory at first glance. What triggered his recognition was the bag's brand marking, which was still faintly legible through the degradation on the inside of the flap once it was carefully opened in the evidence lab. A small manufacturer's mark reading S&W in a stylized serif font, the logo of Sherman & Walsh, a mid-tier photography accessories manufacturer based in Rochester, New York, that had produced this specific bag model, the Fieldmaster II, exclusively between 1972 and 1976. It was a 4-year production run. It was a rare bag. And there was, in the park's digitized archival files, scanned from the original paper records by a summer intern in 2019, a photograph of Daniel Aldric Voss, taken in the spring of 1974 by a fellow Cornell graduate student, in which he was standing at the edge of Cayuga Lake with his Nikon F2 on its strap, and hanging from his left shoulder, a black Sherman and Walsh Fieldmaster II camera bag. Dr. Reeve pulled that photograph up on his laptop screen at 4:17 in the afternoon of June 19, 2026, and sat for a moment in the evidence room in Mammoth Hot Springs looking at it, and at the excavated bag in its container beside him. The camera was inside. That was the thing that stopped everyone who would subsequently be told about it. 52 years of drainage water and soil chemistry, and thermal cycling and seasonal freeze-thaw, and the 1988 fires. The fires had not reached that drainage. It was determined. But the heat had been sufficient in the surrounding area to affect soil temperature for several months, and the Nikon F2 photomic was still inside the bag, not intact in any functional sense. The metal body was corroded, the rubber grips dissolved, the lens's optical glass long since clouded and cracked, but recognizable, definitively, specifically recognizable as the camera body it had been. The serial number, when cleaned with archival solvents, read 7301842, a number that matched the serial number on the purchase receipt found in Daniel Voss's cabin room in 1974, photocopied and filed in Evidence Box 74IELL-2287, and now, 5 decades later, retrieved from archival storage and held alongside the recovered object. And inside the camera, still seated in the film rail, was a roll of film.
This is where the story changes its nature. Up until this point, we had a classic disappearance in the wilderness, a route, a search, no traces, decades of uncertainty. But the film inside the camera is no longer just physical evidence, it is a potential witness. Silent, damaged by time, but a witness nonetheless. Imagine, for 52 years, the camera lies in the ground, in the damp near a thermal zone, goes through frosts, rains, fires somewhere nearby, and yet inside it remains a chance to see the last frames of a person who disappeared. In such cases, this is truly a rare moment because the past suddenly ceases to be abstract. Instead, it literally develops right before your eyes, frame by frame.
The identification of the roll as potentially viable, or rather potentially containing any image at all after 5 decades of extreme environmental exposure, was made by Dr. Helena Strauss, 58, a forensic imaging specialist from the FBI's Laboratory Division in Quantico, Virginia, who had been contacted by Dr. Reeve within hours of the camera's identification and who was on a flight to Montana by the following morning. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman with close-cropped silver hair who, her colleagues said, communicated primarily through the quality of her silences. She had worked film recovery cases before, 8 in her career, including a case involving a camera recovered from a wreck site and a case involving film found in a flood-damaged property, and she was direct about the odds. At 52 years with this level of moisture and thermal variation, she told Dr. Reeve over coffee at the Mammoth Hotel, I would normally tell you to expect nothing. But Kodachrome 64 has a different chemistry from most emulsions. It was designed to last. The silver halide crystals don't dissolve as readily in water as other film stocks, and if the film canister maintained any seal, even a partial one, it's possible some frames retained image information. She paused. I'm not promising anything. The film extraction and processing required 5 days, conducted at a specialized laboratory in Denver. The results were shared with the NPS on June 26, 2026. Of the 36 frames on the roll, 27 had been rendered completely dark, chemically destroyed by moisture over the decades. 6 frames showed partial image information, degraded to the point of suggesting only broad tonal masses of light and dark without discernible subject matter. 3 frames were recoverable with digital enhancement. The 3 frames showed, in sequence, a view looking down from a high vantage point across a slope of rhyolite and lodgepole pine toward a river corridor below, the light coming from the east at a shallow angle that suggested early morning. A close-up of the rock surface immediately beneath the camera, showing a distinctive circular thermal stain, the orange-brown mineral deposit characteristic of sulfur-bearing geothermal vent activity, in the rock at what appeared to be the lip of a small depression or opening. And a third image that Dr. Strauss, on first viewing, set down her coffee and said nothing for 30 seconds. The third image was slightly blurred, the framing off-center in a way that suggested the photographer had not composed deliberately, and it showed, against a background of rhyolite and sky, the edge of what appeared to be a human hand. Not Daniel Voss's hand, another person's hand, extended toward the camera from the right edge of the frame. The fingers were curled, the palm was open. The investigation that followed the film recovery operated on 2 parallel tracks from the beginning. The first track was geological, identifying the precise location in which the camera had been used, using the 3 recovered images as spatial reference data. The second track was investigative, identifying the owner of the hand in the 3rd recovered frame. Dr. Reeve coordinated the geological analysis with the USGS's Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, specifically with a senior geothermal geologist named Dr. Kenneth Hartley, 63, a bearded, unhurried man from Bozeman, who had spent 37 years mapping the park's subsurface thermal activity, and who had, he said, been waiting most of his professional life for an excuse to look systematically at the secondary vent structures in the Tower Creek drainage. The thermal stain in the second recovered image was, in Dr. Hartley's expert assessment, characteristic of a specific type of diffuse vent, not a geyser or a hot spring, but a steam vent, a few of the kind that could exist in the rocky terrain south of Tower Junction, in areas that received no regular visitor traffic and had not been systematically mapped. The park has thousands of these, Dr. Hartley said. We've documented approximately 300 in the northern sector, but there are certainly more we've never cataloged, particularly in the drainage channels where the rock formations create cavities. The comparison between the topographic features visible in the first recovered image, the angle of the river corridor below, the specific configuration of the rhyolite outcroppings in the middle ground, the elevation relative to the valley floor, and the park's high-resolution LiDAR survey data, conducted by the NPS in 2021 as part of its backcountry hazard assessment program, allowed Dr. Hartley and a GIS specialist from the USGS to narrow the probable photography location to a search zone of approximately 0.4 square kilometers on the western face of a rhyolite ridge, 2.1 miles south of Tower Junction. This area was within a quarter mile of the location where the camera bag had been found. It was terrain that lay entirely off any established trail, accessible only by a steeply graded descent through loose rock and sparse vegetation from the ridge above. On the morning of Thursday, July 2, 2026, Dr. Reeve led a team of 4 investigators into that search zone at 7 o'clock in the morning, entering from the ridge above and descending the western face in a systematic line search pattern. The air at that elevation and hour smelled of sulfur, faint but consistent, the planetary exhalation of the geology beneath them, a smell that visitors to the geyser basins found dramatic, but that the park's long-term staff had learned to notice the way others notice weather, as a kind of background information about the state of things below the surface. The rock here was pale gray rhyolite, fractured by thermal stress into slabs and blocks that tilted at irregular angles, creating a series of shelves and depressions that held shadow long after the sun had cleared the ridge to the east. Sparse lodgepole pines had rooted in the cracks wherever soil had accumulated, their trunks growing at odd angles as the rock beneath them shifted across the years. At 9:40 in the morning, one of the investigators, a 34-year-old NPS special agent named Tomas Guerrero, who had joined the Investigative Services Branch 4 years earlier after a decade with the FBI, located an anomaly in the rock face approximately 22 meters below the ridge crest. It was a horizontal crack between 2 large rhyolite slabs, approximately 3 feet wide and 18 inches tall, partially occluded by a third slab that had shifted inward from the left, creating an irregular triangular opening. The opening exhaled air that was measurably warmer than the ambient temperature. Agent Guerrero estimated the difference at 12 degrees using a digital thermometer, and that carried a stronger sulfur compound than the surrounding area. A thin orange-brown mineral stain framed the upper edge of the opening, consistent with the stain in the second recovered image. They documented everything before touching anything. Dr. Reeve photographed the opening from 6 angles. Agent Guerrero collected air samples. A second team member, forensic archaeologist Dr. Sharon Feld, 47, from the University of Wyoming, examined the ground immediately before the opening with a fiber optic scope rather than entering. What the scope revealed, in the narrow beam of its LED light directed into the space beyond the opening, was a cavity of modest dimensions, perhaps 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide, the ceiling varying between 4 and 6 feet. Formed by the natural geology of overlapping rhyolite slabs, the floor of the cavity was partially covered with what appeared to be fine gray sediment, the product of decades of mineral deposition from the vent activity below. Partial human remains were found at the back of the cavity, against the far wall, beneath a 4-inch accumulation of mineral sediment. The position, and this was determined by forensic anthropologist Dr. Peter Bale, who arrived at the site on July 3, 2026, and spent 2 days conducting the careful excavation, was consistent with a body that had either crawled or fallen into the cavity and come to rest against the back wall. The bones were largely disarticulated, the disarticulation consistent with 50-plus years of thermal activity, ground moisture cycling, and the small biological activity that the vent environment permitted. but they were present, and among them, still legible despite its 52 years of thermal and chemical exposure, was a steel-buckled canvas strap from an external frame backpack, the Kelty Corporation's Model K3, which had been in production in 1974 and was documented in the original 1974 investigation as the specific pack Daniel Voss had been carrying on the day of his disappearance. The dental records obtained from Carol Ann Voss's files and from the records of the Binghamton dentist who had treated Daniel through his adolescence, confirmed the identification on July 8, 2026. Dr. Bale delivered his formal conclusion at 11 o'clock in the morning in a phone call to Dr. Reeve in a brief declarative sentence that contained no qualifications because it required none. The identification was positive.
Pay attention to how the logic of the investigation is built here. There wasn't one single miraculous piece of evidence that explained everything at once. There were several independent lines of inquiry, and each one confirmed the other. First, it was a rare model bag that perfectly matched the photo of Daniel, then a Nikon serial number that matched a receipt from an old case, then the film, 3 recovered frames, geological features on the stone, a thermal spot, terrain, all cross-referenced with LiDAR data. And only after that, the precise search zone, the discovery of the cavity, the remains, backpack hardware, and finally, the dental records. It's like assembling a map from scraps, where each scrap is small on its own, but together they lead to a specific point. And here it's clear, the investigators didn't guess. They proved the path.
The young man who had walked south from Tower Junction on the morning of August 14, 1974, had fallen, or stepped, or scrambled into a concealed natural cavity in the rhyolite terrain west of the trail corridor, in a zone that received no regular visitor traffic and that the search teams of 1974 had not systematically covered, in a location 73 meters from the nearest established trail. The cavity's thermal vent, which had been producing its faint sulfurous exhalation for however many thousands of years, the geology had been arranged in this particular way, had maintained a microenvironment of elevated temperature and mineral-rich humidity that had, paradoxically, partially preserved both organic and inorganic materials within it, while rendering the cavity inaccessible to most biological activity. He had fallen in. The geological analysis of the cavity walls, specifically of the fractured edge of the upper slab where fresh rock was exposed beneath the mineral patina, indicated that the slab had shifted within the past century. The NPS geothermal team estimated, based on the degree of new patina formation, between 40 and 70 years earlier. The shift had been in the inward direction, partially closing the opening. It was possible, it was in fact, the considered conclusion of the forensic team, that the cavity had been somewhat more accessible in August 1974 than it was when discovered in 2026, and that the ongoing thermal activity had gradually moved the slab. The third recovered image, the photograph of the open hand, was never definitively explained. It showed a hand that was not Daniel's. The directionality of the image, the position of the camera relative to the hand, made this clear. There was no other person reported missing from Yellowstone National Park on or around August 14, 1974. A comprehensive review of the park's incident records from June through September of that year produced no relevant matches. The hand's identity, whose it was, how it came to be photographed, under what circumstances the photograph was taken, remains, as Dr. Reeve wrote in his formal summary, an open question within a closed case. The notification call to Carol Ann Voss was made by Chief Ranger of Yellowstone National Park, Dr. Alicia Fontaine, a 49-year-old career NPS administrator from Santa Fe, who had been briefed on the case's specifics 2 weeks before the identification, and who had, in preparation for this call, read the entire case file, including the original incident report and the transcripts of the 1974 witness interviews. She called Carol Ann at her home in Binghamton at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 8, 2026. Carol Ann was 81 years old. She had some difficulty with her hearing in the lower frequencies, and Dr. Fontaine spoke slowly and clearly. She told her what had been found, where it had been found, and what the identification confirmed. Carol Ann did not respond immediately. There was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds that Dr. Fontaine described afterward as one of the most weighted silences she had experienced in her professional life. Then Carol Ann said, Was he close to the trail? Dr. Fontaine said yes, 73 meters from the nearest trail, approximately a quarter mile from where the searchers had focused their effort in 1974. There was another pause. Then Carol Ann Voss said, He wasn't lost then, he just fell. There was no perpetrator, no arrest, no courtroom. This is what distinguishes some of the most tenacious disappearance cases from the ones we are accustomed to seeing resolved in the grammar of crime and punishment, the ones that end with handcuffs and a reading of rights, and a defendant who turns to look at the gallery one last time before being led away. The case of Daniel Aldric Voss ended without a villain, and this was, for some of the people who had spent time in the orbit of his absence, the hardest resolution to receive. The mind, conditioned by decades of true crime narratives, reaches for an adversary. When there is none, it must reckon with something harder: the universe's profound indifference to the plans of the living. What the case of Daniel Voss produced, instead of a trial, was a public reckoning with a set of systematic failures in backcountry search methodology. Failures that, it must be said, were not the result of negligence or incompetence, but of the limits of what was achievable in 1974 with the resources and technology of that era. The NPS released a formal findings report on October 3, 2026, authored jointly by Dr. Marcus Reeve and Dr. Kenneth Hartley, titled Recovery of Missing Person, Daniel A. Voss. Findings, geothermal context, and recommended search protocol revisions for backcountry terrain with secondary thermal activity. The report ran to 67 pages. Its essential argument was this: that Yellowstone's secondary hydrothermal terrain, the diffuse vent areas, the steam fissures, the unstable rhyolite formations in the off-trail zones between major basin areas represented a category of backcountry hazard that was systematically underrepresented in both the park's visitor safety materials and its search and rescue protocols. The fumarole zone where Daniel Voss had died was classified, following the investigation, as a restricted backcountry thermal hazard zone, one of 34 such zones newly designated across the park's northern sector following a comprehensive survey conducted in August and September of 2026. The report recommended mandatory thermal hazard awareness training for all backcountry permit applicants. It recommended the implementation of a real-time ground-penetrating radar survey of the Tower Creek drainage and in 6 similar drainage zones with known secondary thermal activity. It recommended that search protocol for missing persons in backcountry thermal terrain include systematic off-trail coverage of secondary vent areas using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging rather than relying on trail-centered search grids. And it recommended the installation of marker posts at the boundaries of the newly designated hazard zones, posts bearing a simple aluminum plate with a symbol, a circle divided by a diagonal line, the universal marker for do not enter, and a brief text explanation of the hazard below. The first of these posts was installed on the morning of October 15, 2026, by a crew of 3 NPS maintenance workers at the edge of the rhyolite zone above the drainage channel where Daniel Voss had died. The post was made of treated steel and embedded 2 feet into the rock substrate with concrete. It was unremarkable to look at. 3 hikers passed it that same afternoon on the ridge trail above, reading the aluminum plate and moving on. Daniel Voss flew to Yellowstone in September of 2026, 3 months after the identification. She was 81 years old, and she had not been on an airplane in 9 years. And the flight from Binghamton to Bozeman, with a connection in Chicago, left her tired in the deep bone way that long travel leaves people of advanced age. But she had asked to come, and the NPS had arranged her transportation and accommodation, and had assigned a liaison, a young interpretive ranger named Sophia Barrett, 24, who picked her up at the Bozeman airport in a government vehicle and drove the 90 miles to the park through the light of a September afternoon that was gold at the edges and cold at the center. The same quality of high Rocky Mountain autumn light that had, 52 years earlier, turned the canyon walls the color of fire and prompted a young man in a cabin doorway to hold his coffee and look up at the sky. Carol Ann did not want to go to the site. She had thought about it for 3 months and had concluded that there was nothing at the bottom of that drainage that could tell her anything she did not already know. She asked instead to be taken to Tower Junction. Sophia drove her to the trailhead parking area, and they got out and stood at the edge of the asphalt where the gravel began, where Ray Tillman had watched Daniel pause and look up at the sky through the lobby window 52 years earlier. And Carol Ann stood there for a long time. She had brought one of his field notebooks from the plastic bin on his desk, the one from the spring of 1974, the last one he had filled before leaving for Wyoming, its pages covered in his compressed, left-tilted handwriting, observations about light and angle and the behavior of birds over the lake in early morning. She did not open it. She held it against her chest with both hands and stood at the edge of the asphalt and looked at the trail entering the trees. Then she nodded once, with the finality of someone completing a sentence they had been in the middle of for half a century, and she turned and walked back to the car. The 3 recovered photographs from Daniel Voss's camera were donated by Carol Ann to the National Park Service's Historical Records Collection in November of 2026, along with his field notebooks, his Cornell student identification card, and a copy of the receipt for the Nikon F2 Photomic, purchased at the 42nd Street camera dealer in October of 1973. The photographs were archivally scanned, and the originals printed on acid-free paper. They are stored in acid-free sleeves in a climate-controlled archive in the park's administrative building at Mammoth Hot Springs. The 3rd photograph, the one showing the open hand, is stored alongside the other 2, labeled with the same accession number. Its provenance described in the archival record simply as Source: Camera recovered from backcountry thermal zone, Tower Creek drainage, June 18, 2026. Identity of hand and frame, unknown. Ray Tillman, who had been the last person to see Daniel Voss walk out of the Roosevelt Lodge and turn right toward the trailhead, had gone on to graduate from UCLA, built a career in landscape architecture in the Bay Area, married twice, raised 3 children, and retired to a house in Sebastopol, California, where he kept a kitchen garden and 2 cats. He had spoken to investigators twice over the 5 decades of the open case, once in 1974 and once in 1988, when Robert Eves, the private detective, had tracked him down. When Dr. Reeve called him in July of 2026 to inform him of the case's resolution, Ray Tillman was 70 years old and was sitting on his back porch in the early morning drinking coffee. He listened to the details. He said very little. When Dr. Reeve was finished, Ray said, "He was right about the light, you know. I've been to Yellowstone twice since then, and he was right about the light." Dr. Reeve said yes, he supposed he was. Ray Tillman thanked him for calling and went back inside. Thomas Henderson, the civil engineer from Sacramento who had talked to Daniel over the road map in the Tower Junction parking area and whose daughter had looked through the camera's viewfinder at the treetops, died in 2003. His daughter Melissa, now 59 and a pediatric nurse in San Diego, was informed of the case's resolution by a reporter from the Associated Press who had obtained her name through the 1974 incident records, which had been released to the public domain. She remembered it. She had been 7 years old, and she remembered the young man with the camera who had crouched down to show her how the viewfinder worked. The small circle of glass, the trees inverted in it, and then standing upright and shouldering his pack and walking toward the trail with a particular deliberateness of step. She had watched him go. "I remember thinking he looked like someone in a movie," she said, "like someone who knew exactly where he was going." The last entry in Daniel Voss's field notebook from the spring of 1974 was written on the evening of June 30th, 1974, 6 weeks before his departure for Wyoming. It was a description of the light on Cayuga Lake at sunset, the way the water held the color after the sky had released it, the way that quality of late light made the ordinary surface of things, a dock, a canoe, a flat stone skipped by a child in the afternoon, seemed to contain a significance that reason could not account for. He had written, at the end of that entry, a single line separate from the descriptive paragraph, bracketed as a thought apart from the rest. "The photograph doesn't capture the light. It captures the fact that the light was there." The Nikon F2 Photomic, serial number 7301842, is displayed in a sealed archival case in the Canyon Village Visitor Center's interpretive exhibit on park history and safety, installed in December of 2026, alongside a brief explanatory panel. The camera is recognizable for what it is: the corroded metal body, the seized aperture ring, the cracked glass of the lens, and beside it, mounted at the same level, are the 3 recovered photographs. The first 2 show geological features in the specific documentary style of someone who came to the wilderness not to conquer it, but to know it. The third shows the open hand, extended from the edge of the frame, its identity unresolved, its presence unexplained, its palm open toward the lens, in a gesture that could mean any number of things, depending on the moment and the eye and what the light was like when it was made. The panel beside the exhibit notes that the thermal hazard zone where Daniel Voss died has been designated and marked, that the search and rescue protocols in thermal backcountry terrain have been revised, and that the recovered images represent the last photographic record made by a person whose disappearance prompted a half-century of searching. It notes that backcountry permits in Yellowstone National Park now include a mandatory acknowledgement of thermal hazard zones, which must be read and initialed by every backcountry permit applicant before the permit is issued. In the calendar year of 2026, the park issued 14,200 such permits. In 2027, the number rose to 15,800. Each person who initialed the form was told, in 6 lines of clearly printed text at the bottom of the acknowledgement page, that the secondary thermal zones of the backcountry, the places away from the famous geysers, away from the boardwalks, and the interpretive panels, and the crowds with their telephoto lenses pointed at bison, were the most hazardous terrain in the park precisely because they were the least marked. Carol Ann Voss died in Binghamton on March 4, 2027, at the age of 82, 6 months after her visit to Tower Junction. Her obituary in the Binghamton Press and Sun Bulletin, written by a staff writer who had covered her story for the past year, noted that she had maintained an open case file for 52 years, attended it with the discipline of a professional and the devotion of a mother, and had lived long enough to hold its resolution in her hands. It noted that she was survived by no children. It noted that she had donated her son's field notebooks to the Cornell University Library, where they were accessioned into the natural history collections under the heading Voss, Daniel Aldric, 1948 to 1974. It noted that she had asked in her will for no funeral service, only a small gathering of friends at the Binghamton Library, where she had worked for 27 years, in the reading room where the atlases were kept, with the good afternoon light coming through the south-facing windows. The bifocals on their beaded chain were placed, at Carol Ann's request, with her son's hiking boots, the pair he had left in the cabin closet, the toes pointing outward at a slight angle, in a private gift to the Roosevelt Lodge, where a housekeeper named Patricia Morales received them and set them on a shelf in the back office, without entirely understanding the history, only sensing that they arrived with a weight that ordinary objects do not carry, and that they deserved, therefore, a careful placement. Outside the lodge, on a morning in late March 2027, with the temperature at Mammoth Hot Springs reading 39 degrees, a seasonal elk herd moved through the parking area in the blue early light, their breath coming in slow columns of steam, their hooves clicking on the asphalt with the unhurried certainty of animals that have never needed to distinguish between the trail and the terrain on either side of it. They passed the edge of the parking area, where the asphalt ends and the gravel begins, and continued south. The light came up over the ridge. The thermal vents in the Tower Creek drainage exhaled their sulfurous warmth into the cold air, as they had been doing for thousands of years before Daniel Voss was born, and as they would continue to do long after every person who had known him had also gone. The park held its silence, and the morning came, and the elk moved through it as if it were simply the world.
This story leaves a strange feeling. On one hand, the Daniel Voss case has finally been answered. He didn't disappear voluntarily, he wasn't the victim of a criminal, he didn't dissolve into legend. He was nearby, frighteningly nearby, just tens of meters from the route. But on the other hand, there remains that which cannot be closed, the photograph with someone else's hand. And perhaps that is exactly why the story is so gripping. It reminds us that even when an investigation is formally closed, the past doesn't always give everything up completely. The main lesson here is simple and cruel. Nature is not obligated to be understandable, safe, or fair, and technology, memory, and human persistence sometimes return exactly those who have remained in silence for too long. If this story hooked you, share the video and write in the comments which moment seemed the most powerful or the most disturbing.